our speakers. So, Dr. Ana Maria Gonzalez Barrero is an assistant professor here in the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders and a speech-language pathologist. Her research interests focus on language literacy and cognitive skills of monolingual and bilingual children with typical development and children with neurodevelopmental conditions like autism spectrum disorders. Dr. Gonzalez Barrero just joined us in September, so welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to give this colloquia talk.
Thank you very much, Emily. Okay. Okay. So hello, everyone. And I'm just going to move the camera a little bit. Hope you can see me there. Thank you for being here today for this colloquium. I'm Ana Maria Gonzalez Barrero. I'm assistant professor here at Dalhousie in the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders. And I'm very excited to present this talk about bilingualism and children with autism spectrum disorders. I look at language, narrative, and executive functioning skills. It's not working. Okay. So first, I would like to acknowledge that the land Dalhousie sits on, it's part of Mi'kmaqui, the territory of the Mi'kmaq, and that all of us have responsibilities under these treaties. And as a new settler in Nova Scotia, I'm grateful for the land and its people, and learning every day about their history and how I can contribute to actions of truth and reconciliation. So here we have the outline for today's talk. First, I'll start by discussing some background information about bilingualism and ASD. Then I'll present some studies I conducted concerning vocabulary, narrative, and executive functioning skills. And then I'll finish by talking about best practices to quantify language exposure in young children, some ongoing research with students at my lab, and some general conclusions. So to start, I would like you to think about this scenario. Imagine that for work or educational reasons, you have to move to a country where you don't speak the societal language. Now imagine that you had a baby. So my question for you is, in which language do you think you would talk to your baby? Probably your native language, right? So for most of you, English. And what is the reason for that? Well, because your native language is your more natural language to communicate, and also because you might have a lack of proficiency in your second language. You might know some words, but communicating with a child implies that you have that you're really proficient in that language and that you're able to express and communicate different feelings to your child, right? Now, imagine that your child was diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. Would you continue using your native language to communicate with your child? Or would you just stop using English and start communicating in the societal language? Probably you would continue using your native language, right? And it seems an obvious answer to this question, but that's not as clear for parents of children with ASD who are growing up bilingual. And actually in Canada and around the world, bilingual children are an important population given globalization, immigration, and the growing number of families for whom bilingualism is a common practice. For example, here in Canada, around 18% of children between the ages of 0 and 9 are growing up bilingual at home. And what's interesting is that this increase comes not only from children who live in large metropolitan areas, as you can see here in the map, like Vancouver or Montreal or Toronto, but also for children who live in the Northwest Territory. So for children who speak an indigenous language and another language, usually English, and depending on the area, it could be French. So we see that there is an increased bilingualism rate for children in Canada. And here we have the childhood bilingualism rates in the Atlantic provinces. So the rate, this is the rate of bilingualism for children aged from 0 to 9. This is based on the census data from 2016. So in Nova Scotia, there is approximately 8% of children who are bilingual. In Halifax, we have a higher concentration of bilingualism, so it's 11%. In the other provinces, in New Brunswick, we have 13%, Newfoundland and Labrador, 4%, and Prince Edward Island, 10%. So when we look at these demographics, it is likely that some clinicians are going to have bilingual children in their caseload. But despite this increase in bilingualism, research including bilingual children with communication disorders, with developmental disorders, is very limited. So most studies have included children who have Down syndrome, children who have developmental language disorder, and those studies have been conducted, some of them, by some pioneer researchers here at Dalhousie, as Dr. K. Reinebert and Dr. Cliff. But studies regarding and concerning the language skills of children who have autism spectrum disorder are really limited and scarce. So let's continue with the second part of the talk by looking at the language, narrative, and executive functioning skills of bilingual children with autism. These studies I'm going to be discussing were conducted in Montreal, in Quebec, which is a large bilingual city. And they were part of my dissertation when I was at McGill, and these were conducted in collaboration with Dr. Aparna Naik. So first, it's important to define what is autism spectrum disorders. So autism spectrum disorders, or ASD, are neurodevelopmental disorders that are characterized by deficits in social communication and interaction, and also the presence of restricted interests and repetitive behaviors. And here we have the quote of a mom of a child with ASD. Before the diagnosis, we always spoke Chinese. I was hoping that he would know both Chinese and English. After the diagnosis, things changed a lot. I was anxious because Kenneth was so late in talking. My logic was simple. Being good in one language was better than being bad at 3 languages. So I changed to speak in English. And this is the reality of many bilingual families who have a child with ASD, because there is this belief that bilingualism might confuse the child, is too taxing or too challenging, given the child's cognitive resources and the communication difficulties that are part of the clinical profile of these children. However, parents also are aware that bilingualism is important for child's quality of life. So being bilingual might allow the child to communicate with other members of the family, as well as has some implications for future professional and educational opportunities. And for clinicians, it's also challenging to provide advice to parents. Some perspectives from clinicians that have been reported are that still some clinicians advise parents to raise the child monolingually when there is a diagnosis of ASD. Some clinicians also hold favorable opinions about bilingualism, but they report that there is limited evidence to guide clinical decisions. So some clinicians are not sure how to advise parents about whether they should help their child to become bilingual. And the available studies in the field, which are not that many, have shown that bilingualism does not hinder language development for children with ASD. But most of these studies were conducted with infants, toddlers, and preschool children. But there was not information at the time when I was doing my dissertation about the language skills of bilingual children with autism during the school age years. And why is important to look at school-age children language skills? Well, what is interesting is that at the school age, you know that children acquire more sophisticated language skills to participate in educational settings. So we took advantage of the highly bilingual context of Montreal to conduct these studies. So in Montreal, Quebec, the official language is French, but Montreal is a very multicultural city where people speak English, French, and other languages. So English and French have highly valued in the society. Also, we have French school boards and English school boards. So this was the perfect scenario to conduct these studies. So my target sample was school-age children, typically helping children and children with ASD. And I look at different language and cognitive abilities, but today I'm only covering vocabulary, narrative skills, and executive functioning. So we recruited over 100 participants. This was over 2 years, and children were required to be speakers of French, English, or Spanish, or any combination of these two languages. And this was given that we wanted to use standardized tests, and we only found tests that were available in these languages, and also to control for the effect of language typology in our results. We were able to recruit 65 typically developing children and 49 children with ASD. And from these children, we were able to find 15 bilingual children who had ASD. All children with ASD were required to have an IQ, a nonverbal IQ higher than 80, so they didn't have intellectual disability. And it seems that 15 children with ASD is not that much, but actually finding this sample was very difficult because we wanted the children to be verbal. They were between 5 to 10 years of age. At that moment, we couldn't recruit through schools because the school boards were not accepting more ethics approvals and all this ethics documentation. So it was really hard to find these children. And also it was hard because, as I was just saying, many parents are advised to raise their child monolingual. So it's very difficult to find bilingual children with ASD who are verbal and who are able to communicate in both languages, because we assess these children in both languages too. So let's look at vocabulary skills. These are two separate studies that look at vocabulary skills using a standardized test. So in the first study, our main question was, can some bilingual children with ASD score within the average range on standardized test? And our second study looked at what factors predict language proficiency in children with ASD. So in this study, we included only participants who had ASD. We had 13 monolingual children and 13 bilingual children. And we assessed the receptive vocabulary in their dominant language. And by dominant language, I mean the language the child had a greater exposure to or was more proficient in. And we used the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, or its French version, depending on the language dominance of the child. We match our participants in several important factors that can influence vocabulary development, such as nonverbal IQ, chronological age, maternal education, and dominant language. And here we have the results from a t-test, and what we found was a significant difference between the monolingual and the bilingual children. So the monolingual are represented in blue, bilingual in green. We found a significant difference where the monolingual outperformed the bilingual children. But what was interesting is that many bilingual children with autism still perform within the average range, which is represented by these dotted lines. In our second study, we conducted a multiple regression analysis, and we included key factors for vocabulary development, such as age, language exposure, nonverbal IQ, and working memory. And in this study, we look at language exposure as a continuum. So you can see here in the x-axis, it was a continuum from 0 exposure to French to 100% exposure. So we're looking at bilingualism as a continuum, not a categorical variable. And we included children who have some degree of exposure to French to see which predictors were the most important ones for language, for vocabulary development. Here, the blue dots represent children who are typically developing. The red triangles represent children with ASD, and the red triangles that have a white background represent children with ASD who have also language impairment.
We're doing presentations.
Sorry. Okay. So results from this regression show that the strongest predictor in this model was the current amount of language exposure, which accounted for 62% of the variance in vocabulary skills. So here we replicated prior work showing a strong relationship between language exposure and vocabulary development in typical development. But the new finding here is that children with ASD can become bilingual if they have enough language exposure. In addition, here we can see at these results that they are in line with some prior work by Tordardotir in 2011, who found that to perform within the average range on standardized tests, typically developing bilingual children need to have an exposure of at least 40% to a language. This is to perform within the average range in standardized tests of vocabulary, like receptive vocabulary. And if we see here this graph, when we see the 40% mark, we see that both typically developing children, but also children with ASD start performing within the average range in this test, which here the average range is also denoted by the dotted lines. Of course, children who have language impairment and ASD, for them it's going to be more difficult to perform within the average range, but that's expected given their language profile. So just as a summary here, we saw that overall these studies show that it is possible for some children who are growing up bilingual to perform within the average range in standardized tests, even if they have an autism spectrum disorder. Also, we saw that the amount of exposure to a language is an important predictor for vocabulary development. And these results are important given that if a bilingual child with ASD has levels of exposure that are expected to develop functional proficiency in his or her non-dominant language, and still this child is not able to communicate in that language, further assessment might be needed just to explore the presence of a language impairment, if there is a lack of identification with the language, or what is impeding the development of this second language. Now let's look at narrative skills. So in the previous studies, we saw the performance of bilingual children with ASD in standardized tests. And these were tests of receptive vocabulary. But how do these children use their expressive vocabulary? So in another study, which was led by my student, Juan Huang, who is now an SLP working in Alberta, we looked at a more natural task, not standardized, but more open task. And we examined the narrative skills of children in this task. So it was, we just included a small sample of children. We had 5 children in each group, and we look at their narrative skills in French. In this study, we gave children some images. It was a sequence of 3 images, and they were asked to sort these cards, to just organize them, put them in a logical order, and to tell a story based on this sequence. Participants also were matched on age, on nonverbal IQ, maternal education, and these are very important variables to control for when you're looking at narrative. And as would be expected, the bilingual children had lower scores, lower receptive vocabulary scores than the monolingual children. creating a narrative requires the coordination of multiple levels of language. We have the macro structure, which makes reference to a global coherence of a narrative. For example, how the child is sequencing that, which looks at the local cohesion within the story. For example, the use of correct pronouns, grammatical gender, if the child is using connectors. And we also look at elaborations, which are just elements that the child can use to engage the listener's attention. So for example, the use of sound effects on in each. Dr. Pananola to look at these. And one of the main findings was that overall, children who were developing typically neurotypical children perform significantly better than children with ASD regarding macrostructure and microstructure. You can see here the different scores. And overall, children with typical development had more cohesive and coherent stories. They use more connectors. So here we have some examples. This is an example from a typically developing child who just organized these cards, and the child said, La petite fille fait un gâteau. The little girl made a cake. Elle a mis de la confiture. She added jam. Et après, elle le mange. And after, she eats it. A child with ASD produced this type of story. Elle fait un gâteau. She made a cake. Elle le mange. She eats it. Regarde le couteau. Look, the knife. So as we can see here, the typically developing child used a modified noun phrase, describe the main action in each picture, and also use a conjunction. Whereas the child with ASD just used a pronoun, omitted the action from the second picture, and made a comment that is not totally relevant for the story in the third, using the third image. But here I would also like to bring your attention to these results. And what we found was that there were no significant differences between the monolingual children with ASD and the bilingual children with ASD. So they had difficulties, both groups, with narrative skills, but we didn't find that bilingualism would exacerbate these difficulties. So results from this study show that an area of language intervention for both monolingual and bilingual children with ASD are narrative skills, specifically producing more coherent and unambiguous stories, as well as the correct use of pronouns. And also more important is that we didn't find significant differences between monolingual and bilingual children with ASD, which is interesting because even though the vocabulary of bilingual children is smaller relative to that of the monolinguals, they still are able to perform in a similar way in this narrative task. Now let's look at executive functions. So executive functions is a term that is used to describe the different cognitive processes that people use to control their behavior. For example, memory, attention, inhibition, planning. And set shifting or cognitive flexibility is the ability to accurately switch back and forth between tasks. And this is one of the subdomains of executive functioning. And when we think about ASD, set shifting is closely related to some of the core deficits in ASD, such as the presence of repetitive behaviors and restricted interests, and also some difficulties with transitions that these children have. And also set shifting or cognitive flexibility is often reported as an area of impairment in children with ASD. But what is interesting is that some researchers have found that bilingualism, being bilingual, can confer some advantages to some executive functioning abilities. And one specific domain in which different studies have reported some advanced skills is cognitive flexibility for bilingual, typically developing individuals, like older individuals and children. So for this study, wanted to know whether bilingualism confers advantages in set shifting for children who have ASD. In this study, we included 40 participants that were closely matched on age, nonverbal IQ, maternal education, dominant language, and also ASD symptomatology. So we had 10 participants in each group. And our hypotheses were that we expected to see differences in the set shifting, the cognitive flexibility tasks. And we also wanted to include a control task where we didn't expect to see any differences, and that was working memory. So usually bilingualism confers advantages in some domains, but not all the different domains of executive functioning. The measures we used to measure this were the dimensional change cursor task that developed by Dalhousie, and we developed a computerized version here for this study. And for the verbal working memory, we used number repetition backwards from the clinical evaluation of language fundamentals, so from the set. Here we have the dimensional change cursor task. So in this task, children are asked to sort images depending on different criteria. So first, there is a phase that is called the pre-switch phase, where children are asked to just sort this image, this boat, for example, that is blue, by color. So they need to choose this blue rabbit. So they will start just sorting by color, just choosing by color. After that, there is a post-switch phase where the rule changed. So children need to update the information they had before, and they switch. They have to be flexible to start now sorting by shape. So if they have a boat, for example, that is blue, they cannot continue just sorting by color. They need to update and just start choosing the same shape. So boat with boat, and the little rabbit with rabbit. And then there is a advanced version that is called the border version. So in this phase, children need to sort by color if the image has a border, like this in this case, and they need to sort by shape if the image has no border. So this is a little bit more advanced. For the verbal working memory task, it was just, as I said, a number repetition backwards task. So the children were asked to repeat numbers in reverse order. So for example, if we said 5 to 7, the child had to repeat 7 to 5, just backwards. And here we have the percentage of participants who passed the task, so the performance during, this is the dimensional change cursor task, so the first task that we saw. So here the orange bar represents the typically developing monolingual children, green bar represents the typically developing bilingual children, the blue one, the children who were monolingual with autism, and the purple one, children who were bilingual with autism. So during the first phase, everyone was performing very well. We see during the post switch, when they have to now sort by another category, for example, by shape, most of them were performing well. But what is interesting is that in the most advanced or most difficult phase, bilingual children with ASD perform significantly better than monolingual children with ASD, and also significantly better than typically developing bilingual children. Here we have the results from the working memory task, and as expected, children across groups they didn't differ, so they had similar performance across tasks for this working memory measure. So this study showed a better performance in the group of bilingual children with ASD relative to monolingual children with ASD in a task that assessed cognitive flexibility. And we didn't find any differences in working memory for these children across groups. So this suggests that bilingualism has selective effects on executive functions. these studies, something important for us was really contribute to knowledge translation of these results. So we presented these results to the biggest school board in Quebec, which is the English Montreal School Board. We also were invited to present our results in the local news, and this is the QR code you can scan if you want to see the interview. And these results have also been published in non-scientific written outlets, such as ASHAWare, which is the online home for ASHA journals, and as well as in other outlets. So what is interesting here is that if you're working with some parents that don't speak English, that speak other languages, and you want to share these results with them, you probably will find this published in different languages. It has been published in Arabic, in Punjabi, you have Italian as an example. So it's a resource that you can share with parents who are wondering about whether bilingualism is detrimental or not for their children with ASD. Now let's go to the final part of the talk. So I'm going to start by talking about best practices for quantifying language exposure in bilingual children. And this is a project I participated and I helped with during my postdoctoral training. This was in collaboration with Dr. Krista Valles-Heinlein at Concordia University in Montreal. So around 2 years ago, I received an email from a clever grandmother who is a medical doctor, and she was asking about the language development of her grandchildren. So she said, Luca is 2 years, 6 months. He speaks French at home. His dad is a native French speaker, and his mom is bilingual. And he attends an English daycare. My other grandchild, Simon, is 2 years, 8 months, and he's being raised by a bilingual mother who speaks exclusively French to him, and his dad who speaks only English at home. And he attends a bilingual French-English daycare. I'm concerned since Luca talks a lot, but Simon talks less. So as clinicians, we get these types of questions from parents and family members who are raising bilingual children. But measuring bilingual language exposure is not straightforward. We know that for monolingual children, typically they are exposed between 90, 95% to 100% to one language. But bilingual children, not all bilingual children are exposed 50-50 to each language. Actually, it is really rare to find a perfectly balanced bilingual child. So some children have more exposure to one language than the other, and it's important to have accurate estimates of the amount of language exposure they have, because we have seen that amount of language exposure is an important predictor for language abilities, like vocabulary development. So for example, when we were discussing this problem that sometimes we have when we're gathering language estimates, we also discussed that children who are growing up in bilingual families often are part of more than one culture that has different practices that need to be taken also into account. And for example, asking a question like, what % of the time does your child hear English versus French might not be the best approach to obtain accurate information about the child's language exposure. So we decided to develop this tool. And we call this approach MAPLE, so a Canadian reference, and is the multilingual approach to parent language estimates. And the main aim of MAPLE is to gather accurate information on infants' language exposure using a structured interview that is conducted with the infant caregivers. And something unique about MAPLE is that it is an approach that takes into consideration the culture, diversity, and specific background of the family. So using this approach, using MAPLE, we ask parents some background questions, such as the languages that are spoken at home since the child was born. Then we determine the daily exposure to each of the languages of the child during the week and weekend, and we take into consideration the hours the child is awake, how many hours the child sleeps, and different variables. And this allows us to calculate a global estimate of the amount of language exposure the infant has to each language. And when you're conducting a structured interview to assess infant's language environment, this puts you in contact with considerable information about the child and his or her family. So our approach makes emphasis on sensitivity and openness to different family situations, and also on practices to establish trust between an interviewer and the family in order to gather accurate information about the child environment. And we know that, for example, some children are raised by two parents of different gender or the same gender, by a single parent, or some households include extended family members. So it is important to be mindful of the questions and language we use. For example, asking, does your child have another caregiver, is preferred and more appropriate over saying, what about your child's father? So these materials all the form, and there is a video showing how to conduct the interview using Maple, are available in the Open Science Framework, where you have access to the forms, which are in English and in French. And we also wanted to look at their reliability. This information that we're gathering as an interview really providing us accurate information about the child language environment. So in another study, some colleagues at McGill, they look at the reliability. So they recorded children, infants, for different days, 16 hours per day, and they transcribed all of these to look at the specific exposure they had to English and to French. And then we look at the questionnaires that were also filled out. And what we found was high reliability when compared with transcriptions, like very long recordings. So we see that this approach, Maple, is reliable. It's a way that you can use to gather information about language exposure for bilingual children. So as a summary, Maple approach is an accurate language, provides accurate language exposure information for clinicians and researchers, and it advocates also for cultural sensitive interviewing practices. Now I'm just going to discuss some ongoing research with students at my lab. So we are working on a project about verbal fluency in bilingual children with ASD. And this project is being led by Megan Mongo and Anna Gors, who are master students here in the speech language pathology program at Dalhousie. And we know that verbal fluency tasks tap into different lexicosemantic and executive functioning skills. And in a prior study that I conducted, we found that bilingual children with autism produced more words than their monolingual peers with autism in a verbal fluency task when they were matched on vocabulary skills. But here we're examining what are the specific cognitive strategies that yield this increased performance. So we know they're performing better. We look at different switching skills and different words they produce, but right now we're looking at time beams really to understand where is this advantage that we are seeing, which moment during this task we can see this advantage. We also have another project that is being led by Weberly Mulligan, who's an SLP master thesis student here at Dalhousie. And the main topic is SLP's cultural competency working with linguistically diverse clients. So we are developing a survey for Canadian SLPs that are working with pediatric population. Since there are some surveys available and there's information available, but most of the surveys have been conducted in United States, and our demographics and our caseloads are different. So we really want to get to understand what is the SLP's knowledge, what knowledge do SLPs have about cultural appropriate approaches, what is their self-competency about this, and what challenges they face when working with diverse clients. So this survey will be sent next year, so please stay tuned. So just to finish with some general conclusions, these different studies have shown that bilingualism is a suitable option for children on the autism spectrum from bilingual families or societies. Also, that amount of language exposure is the strongest predictor for vocabulary performance in children with autism spectrum disorder, also for typically developing children, and that bilingualism might provide some advantages in cognitive flexibility for children with ASD. Some recent studies are looking at theory of mind for bilingual children who have autism, because theory of mind is an area where children with autism have difficulties. And what it seems that bilingual children perform better in theory of mind tasks relative to monolingual children with ASD, but these are just recent studies, so this is an interesting area of development. So I would like to finish by acknowledging all the participants and their families who contributed their time to this research. The Psychology of Pragmatics Lab at McGill University, all the team at the Concordia Infant Research Lab at Concordia University, and all the funding sources that made possible this research. Thank you very much. Do you have questions?
What was the percentage again that you said of exposure level that was it?
40, yeah. So in a prior study by Dr. she looked at the school children around 5 years old, 5-year-olds, and to perform within the average range on the PPBT, they needed to have in the receptive part, in the PPBT, they needed to have at least 40% of exposure to a language. But that's different for expressive language. So to perform within the average range in the expressive, they needed to have at least 60% of exposure. And we found the same for bilingual children with autism, at least around 40% of exposure to start performing within the average range in standardized tests.
Yeah, and Pat. I can see Pat raised her
Oh.
hand all the way.
I see that, yes. I think if you talk, Pat, maybe we can hear you.
Are you on? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Very good. Thank you for that talk. And I've heard some of it before, but it was interesting to try to think about it. And as you noticed, that trying to establish what exposure is and bilingualism is a complicated picture for sure. The one thing that struck me, and if you can go back to the slide comparing the where you found significant differences between the monolingual and bilingual children with ASD on the executive function task. I'm just trying to remember if I remembered it correctly or not. So my question may not make any sense when I actually see the results.
This one.
Yes. So what strikes me is bilingualism seems to be having a different impact in children with ASD than in typically developing kids. And do you have any thoughts about why that might be, or maybe the difference isn't what's visually it looks like that is the pattern?
Yes, you are totally right. And actually that's something that also was striking for us. So I'm just gonna, because that's a question we also had, I'm just gonna show you this. So we saw that bilingual children with ASD perform better, even than typically developing bilingual children. And we thought, like, why is this the case? So it could be the task demands. So there was a computerized administration that we had versus this social interaction. So when we were conducting this task, we saw that children who had ASD were really interested in the task. They wanted to continue. When we finished the task, they said, I want to continue playing with the computer. So they loved this task. They didn't look at the examiner. They were just really working on this. Typically developing children where they started performing, but they tried to look sometimes to us like, is this okay? Like they needed that social interaction more. That could be one reason. Also motivation, as I was just saying, children with ASD were more motivated with this task. The explicitness of the task. So there was a clear and explicit rule that was given to children with ASD. So it was very clear for them how to do it, which could have supported the way in which they performed. And it could also be possible that there is enhanced visual processing skills for children with ASD. That's a theory also. Some researchers have reported enhanced visual processing skills, so that could be the case. Although when we match them on nonverbal IQ and some of these tasks included kind of visual processing, and they didn't differ, they were matched. So that's also one possibility.
So is it the case that in the typically developing population, it looks like there's a difference between the monolingual and the bilingual, but is that just an artifact of the visual?
You mean for the typically developing ones?
Yeah, so it's like, it looks like bilingualism made the performance of the bilingual group in ASD was better, and the performance of the bilingual was worse than I'm wondering within the group comparison, but it may be an artifact of the picture.
Oh, yes, actually, so that's also like why bilingual advantage is not observed in our typically developing bilingual group. So typically the bilingual advantage that is reported in our papers, like Yalstok, for example, they have many trials. So they have like 200 trials on different blocks, but we had a reduced number of trials in this task. Also, we had a small sample size. So usually the effect size is a median effect size reported for this bilingual advantage. So we would need a larger sample to be able maybe to see those differences between the typically developing bilingual and the typically developing monolingual children. Also gender, usually studies that look at cognitive flexibility and executive functioning include a similar number of females and males. But here, because we were matching children with ASD, we had a larger number of boys of male. And also the bilingual advantage is not consistently found. So it depends in the methodology used. But we think that the reduced number of trials might have played a role, and also the sample size that we had. But yeah, here we found the advantage for the bilingual children with autism relative to the monolingual ones, but we didn't find the advantage for the bilingual children who were neurotypical relative to the monolingual children who were neurotypical.
Okay, yeah, it's interesting that the effect's different depending on the population.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Yes, Nicole.
Just to clarify, were they explicitly told that the rule was going to change, or it was like they could figure it out as they go, that it was now incorrect?
They had a practice trial before they started the task. So to be able to perform the task, they needed to pass, I think it was 3 training trials. So they understand that when you see these, you have to, it showed, it was in the computer and it said the color, and they had to go by color, or shape, and they had to go by shape. But some children, we only had 10 in each group because we only included children who were able to pass the training phase, just to have children who were matched adequately in different variables. So they knew from the beginning what they needed to do. If the child didn't understand or didn't pass the training trials, they were not included. Yeah. So any other questions? Yes.
I'm wondering, I might have missed it, but the typically the monolingual versus the bilingual children with ASD, did they have similar ASD characteristics? So they were.
That's a great question. Yeah, whether typically the bilingual children with ASD and the monolingual children with ASD have like similar autism symptomatology. Yes, but we match also children on that. So all of them had clinical diagnosis of ASD. We were provided with the reports, and we also administered a task. It's just a questionnaire that provides you with, it gives you information about autism symptomatology and the different behaviors the child has. So the higher the score, the more behaviors related to autism the child have. And we match them also on that to make sure that we're controlling for that variable too. Yeah.
So it wasn't just like they were selecting kids that had really mild symptoms for the bilingual.
No, all of them were, they didn't have intellectual disability.
Yeah.
They were verbal,
yeah.
But they have the diagnosis of autism and similar autism symptomatology. So just to control for that too. Yes, that's very important. Any more questions? Okay. So I
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. And yeah, if you have any question, please don't hesitate to contact me. Here you have my email, so I'll be happy to answer any question or to share any resources you might be interested in. Thank you.